My name is, and I am a decorated warrior of the Empire. I have fought across 17 star systems, led charges against the mechanical hordes of the Nexus Collective, and stood firm against the psychic assaults of the caste. In my 3 centuries of military service, I thought I had seen every form of warfare the galaxy could offer. I was wrong. The humans changed everything. They didn't just fight differently, they fought wrong. Every tactical manual, every strategic doctrine, every principle of civilized warfare that had governed galactic conflicts meant nothing to them. They were chaos given form, madness with weapons, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. I need to tell this story because the official reports don't capture the truth. Command wants neat statistics and clean tactical analyses. But you can't explain humans with numbers on a data pad. You have to experience them, survive them, to understand what they really are. It started 3 years ago when the Terran Federation first made contact with the Galactic Council. We thought they were just another species seeking membership, probably with some minor technological advancement to trade for protection and resources. The preliminary reports described them as bipedal mammals from a Class M world called Earth. Nothing remarkable. Their ships were crude but functional, their weapons primitive but effective. We categorized them as a Tier 3 civilization and moved on. Then the hegemony decided to test these newcomers. The R were one of the most feared military powers in the Outer Rim. Their shock troops could punch through fortified positions that had held for decades. Their battle doctrine was built on overwhelming firepower delivered with surgical precision. When they declared war on the Terran Federation, most of us expected it to be over within a solar cycle. I was assigned to the 47th Expeditionary Force as a military observer. Our job was to monitor the conflict and assess both human and capabilities for future reference. We positioned ourselves at the edge of the 442 system, where intelligence suggested the first major engagement would occur. They brought their standard invasion fleet, 60 capital ships arranged in perfect battle formation, supported by 300 smaller vessels. Their approach was textbook: advance in coordinated waves, establish fire superiority, then systematically dismantle enemy defenses. I had seen this formation crush rebel fleets twice its size. The human fleet that met them looked like it had been assembled in a scrapyard. Where they maintained pristine battle lines, the human ships scattered across space in what appeared to be random positions. Their vessels were mismatched, some sleek and new, others obviously repurposed civilian craft with weapons bolted to their hulls. They had no clear command structure that we could identify, no unified formation, no apparent strategy. Admiral, our expedition commander, actually laughed when he saw the tactical display. "Look at them," he said, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "They're positioned like asteroids in a debris field, though we'll cut through them in minutes." The battle began exactly as expected. They opened with a coordinated barrage from their heavy batteries, targeting what appeared to be the largest human vessels. The energy discharge lit up our sensors like a small star being born. When the interference cleared, we expected to see wreckage. Instead, the human ships were gone. Not destroyed, gone. They had scattered in every direction with accelerations that should have their crews. Some dove toward the system's star, others headed for the asteroid belt, and a few actually flew straight at the formation before veering off at impossible angles. "Impossible," muttered our tactical officer. "Those maneuvers would generate forces exceeding 30 gravities. No organic being could survive that." We were about to learn our first lesson about humans. They don't do what's possible, they do what's necessary. They tried to pursue, but their targets kept changing course unpredictably. Every time the alien fleet aligned for another volley, the humans would shift position again. What we initially mistook for random movement revealed itself as something far more disturbing: organized chaos. Then the humans started shooting back. Their weapons fire came from every angle imaginable. Ships hiding in the asteroid belt opened up with improvised mass drivers, hurling chunks of rock at relativistic speeds. The vessels that had dived toward the star emerged from the solar corona, with their hulls glowing white-hot, launching missiles that had been somehow superheated by their passage. But the most unsettling part wasn't their tactics, it was their communication chatter. Most military forces maintain radio discipline during combat. Tactical updates, target assignments, damage reports, all delivered in crisp professional language. The humans never stopped talking, and what they said made no sense. Tango 7 to all units. I've got visual on a big ugly at bearing 27 Mark 4. Looks like it's compensating for something. Copy that, 7. Foxtrot 3 moving to provide some unsolicited percussive maintenance. Alpha Leader to Wing, remember, we're not dying today. Dying is gay and we're not gay. Negative Alpha Leader, I'm totally gay but still not dying. Spite is one hell of a motivator. Our linguist was frantically trying to decode what they meant by gay and compensating, but the humans were already moving to their next impossible maneuver. 3 of their smallest ships actually flew directly into the formation, weaving between capital ships while laying down suppressing fire. Suicide attack, Admiral observed, primitive but effective. Except they weren't trying to suicide. As point defense systems tracked the small craft, larger human ships moved into firing positions on the formation's flanks. The 3 vessels inside the enemy formation suddenly accelerated straight up from the galactic plane, dragging dozens of guns away from their real targets. It was the most insane tactical maneuver I had ever witnessed. It shouldn't have worked. Those 3 ships should have been vaporized instantly. But somehow, they threaded through the defensive fire while their companions systematically destroyed the distracted vessels. The human pilots were still chattering on the comm channels. Nice flying, crazy horse. You've got more balls than a tennis tournament. Thanks, Moondog. Hey, did anyone else notice these alien ships look like someone put rocket engines on a shopping mall? Yeah, they're about as maneuverable as 1-2. Splash another ugly. They were treating the battle like a game. While sentient beings died around them, while their own ships took damage and their comrades were killed, they joked and laughed and made references that our computers couldn't translate. It was deeply unsettling. The tide turned when the humans revealed their true madness. Instead of maintaining safe engagement distances like any rational military force, they began ramming attacks. Not desperate last-resort collisions, deliberate, calculated ramming attacks. Human destroyers would accelerate to attack speed, fire everything they had at a ship, then slam into it at full velocity. The impacts were devastating to both vessels, but the humans seemed to consider this an acceptable trade. Our computers logged 17 separate ramming attacks in the space of 20 minutes. They're destroying themselves, our tactical officer reported, his voice tight with disbelief. This level of acceptable losses would break any rational military force. But the humans weren't breaking. Every ship they lost seemed to inspire the others to fight harder. When a human cruiser took a direct hit from a dreadnought and began breaking apart, the crew didn't evacuate. Instead, they steered the dying vessel into the enemy formation and somehow managed to trigger a reactor overload just as they made contact with their target. The explosion took out 3 capital ships. More disturbingly, the other human crews cheered. Not the grim satisfaction of soldiers achieving an objective, but genuine jubilation, as if their comrade's sacrifice was cause for celebration rather than mourning. Did you see that? Martinez just went full slim on those bastards. Bet he's in Valhalla right now, telling everyone about it. Pour one out for Martinez. He always said he wanted to go out with a bang. I was taking frantic notes, muttering about cultural death worship and ritualized self-destruction. But I was beginning to suspect something else entirely. The humans weren't treating death as worship or ritual. They were treating it as victory. By the time the engagement ended, they had lost 40% of their fleet. The humans had lost 60% of theirs, but they acted like they had won a glorious triumph. Their surviving ships regrouped in the most haphazard formation imaginable and immediately began planning their next attack. "All right, people," came a voice over their command frequency. "We've got them rattled. Time to press the advantage while they're still trying to figure out what the hell just happened." What had just happened was the complete destruction of everything we thought we knew about space warfare. The humans had taken every established tactical doctrine and thrown it out an airlock. They fought like lunatics, died like heroes, and somehow managed to achieve victory through sheer, bloody-minded chaos. Admiral ordered our fleet to maintain observation distance. None of us wanted to get closer to whatever the humans might do next. We didn't have to wait long. 3 standard hours after the first engagement, long-range sensors detected another human fleet entering the system. Not reinforcements, an entirely different force with completely different ship configurations and what appeared to be a totally different command structure. "How many fleets do they have?" asked our intelligence officer. The answer, we would soon learn, was irrelevant. The question should have been, how many different ways can humans find to wage war? The second human fleet deployed in a formation that looked almost conventional compared to the first group. They maintained proper spacing, established clear command lines, and approached the remaining forces with something resembling military discipline. For about 15 minutes, then they opened fire with weapons we had never seen before. Instead of energy beams or kinetic projectiles, they launched what appeared to be small pods at their targets. The pods moved too slowly to be effective missiles and seemed to lack any kind of explosive warhead. The point defense systems ignored them completely. That was a mistake. The pods attached themselves to hulls and began doing something that made our sensors scream warnings. Energy readings spiked across multiple spectrums, gravity fluctuated in impossible ways, and space itself seemed to ripple around the affected vessels. Then the ships started changing. Hull plating twisted into geometric shapes that hurt to look at. Weapon turrets began growing crystalline structures that pulsed with their own light. Engineering sections sprouted what could only be described as metallic vegetation, spreading across the ship's surfaces like some kind of technological cancer. The crews were screaming on emergency frequencies, begging for assistance as their own ships transformed around them. But there was nothing their remaining fleet could do except watch in horror as their comrades' vessels became something that was no longer entirely mechanical. "What are those weapons?" Admiral demanded. Our science officer was staring at his displays with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been shattered. I believe they're nanomachines, but not any kind we've ever encountered. These appear to be programmable matter reconstructors with adaptive artificial intelligence subroutines. In simple terms, the humans just turned enemy ships into something else, something alive. The transformed vessels were now moving with organic fluidity, their weapons firing in patterns that resembled neural networks more than targeting systems. And they were attacking their former comrades. The humans had somehow weaponized metamorphosis. What remained of the fleet tried to retreat, but the transformed ships pursued them with predatory intelligence. The original human fleet moved in to support, and suddenly the battlefield contained three different factions: conventional forces, the second human fleet, and hybrid ship creatures that had once been but were now something entirely different. The human comm chatter during this phase was even more disturbing than before. "Biotech team leader to all units, the conversion process is proceeding within normal parameters. Recommend maintaining safe distance until the integration is complete." "Copy that, biotech. Philosophical question, are we liberating those ships or enslaving them?" "Does it matter? They're on our side now." "Fair point. Ethics are for people who aren't being shot at." They were discussing the violation of every sentient rights treaty in the galactic codes as if they were comparing lunch options. The casual way they referred to conversion and integration suggested this wasn't an experimental weapon. It was standard procedure. How many species had they done this to? The battle, if it could still be called that, ended when the last unconverted ship self-destructed rather than face transformation. The hybrid vessels immediately regrouped with the human fleet as if they had always been part of it. But the humans weren't done. A third fleet emerged from hyperspace just as we thought the engagement was over. This group didn't resemble any of the previous forces. Their ships were massive, blocky constructions that looked more like mobile factories than warships. They deployed throughout the system and began doing something that made our long-range scanners malfunction. They were building. In the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by wreckage and debris, the humans were constructing something. Fabricator ships consumed the remains of destroyed vessels, both human and began assembling structures that easy categorization. "Are those space stations?" our engineering officer asked. "No," replied our science officer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think they're cities." The humans were colonizing the battlefield. Within 6 standard hours, they had erected a series of interconnected habitats using salvaged materials from the engagement. They weren't just claiming the system. They were moving in permanently, setting up mining operations on the asteroids and establishing what appeared to be a full civilian infrastructure. The speed of construction was impossible by any known standard. We watched agricultural domes bloom into existence, while defense platforms sprouted from asteroid surfaces like mechanical flowers. The humans had turned a war zone into a thriving settlement before the debris had even finished dispersing. Admiral ordered our fleet to withdraw to a safe distance and compile a full report. None of us spoke during the journey back to space. What could we say? We had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about warfare, technology, and civilization itself. The humans didn't just fight differently, they existed differently. They treated impossible odds as personal challenges, death as an acceptable career option, and enemy territory as a potential new neighborhood. They weaponized concepts that most species used for peaceful purposes and turned battlefields into construction sites. 3 weeks later, we received word that the hegemony had offered the Terran Federation a full peace treaty, including territorial concessions and technological exchange agreements. The species that had dominated the Outer Rim for 2 centuries had been defeated by newcomers in a single engagement. But that wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The humans accepted the peace treaty, then immediately began recruiting former military personnel into their own forces, not as prisoners or conscripts, as volunteers. Apparently, the warriors were impressed by human tactics and wanted to learn how to fight like that. Within a standard year, joint human fleets were appearing throughout the galaxy, spreading their particular brand of organized chaos to anyone foolish enough to challenge them. The hybrid ships from our engagement became the template for an entirely new class of vessels that somehow combined the best aspects of biological and mechanical systems. My report to command was classified at the highest levels, but word leaked out anyway. Every major military power in the galaxy began developing countermeasures for human tactics, trying to predict what they might do next. It was a futile effort. You can't prepare for chaos. You can only experience it and hope to survive. The humans had introduced something new to galactic warfare, absolute unpredictability combined with ruthless effectiveness. They didn't follow the rules because they didn't know the rules existed. They didn't limit themselves to conventional tactics because they had no idea what conventional meant. And somehow it worked. As I write this, the Terran Federation has been accepted as a full member of the Galactic Council, despite having been in contact with galactic civilization for less than 5 years. Their military advisors are now consulted by species that have been fighting wars for. Their hybrid technology is being studied by every major research institution in known space. The galaxy had existed in a state of relative military equilibrium for thousands of years. The humans shattered that balance in a matter of months, not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to accept limitations. They showed us that chaos, properly directed, could be more effective than any organized strategy, that improvisation could triumph over planning, that sometimes the best way to win a war was to convince your enemy that you were too insane to predict. But this was just our first encounter with human military doctrine. What we witnessed at was apparently what they considered a minor skirmish. The real test of human capabilities came later, when they faced an enemy that actually understood what they were dealing with. That's when we learned that human chaos had rules after all. Terrible, effective rules that made their apparent randomness even more frightening. The Syndicate thought they could beat the humans at their own game. They were wrong in ways that still give me nightmares. The Syndicate made the same mistake everyone else did when they first encountered humans. They assumed that chaos meant stupidity, that randomness indicated lack of planning, that the human way of war was simply advanced barbarism that could be countered with superior intelligence and coordination. They were perfect for testing that assumption. They were a hive-mind species with perfect tactical coordination, instantaneous communication across their entire military structure, and strategic planning capabilities that could predict enemy movements centuries in advance. If anyone could impose order on human chaos, it would be them. I was part of the observer fleet again, this time representing a joint intelligence-gathering mission. Yes, our former enemies were now our allies, united in our fascination and terror of what the humans might do next. The warriors who had survived spoke of the engagement with a mixture of respect and religious awe that was deeply unsettling to witness. The conflict began when they decided that human expansion into the contested Rigel sector represented an unacceptable threat to their long-term strategic interests. Unlike the straightforward invasion approach, they planned a sophisticated campaign designed to exploit what they perceived as human weaknesses. They would use their hive mind coordination to create tactical scenarios too complex for individual human commanders to handle, forcing the humans to either slow down their decision-making process or make critical errors. It was an elegant strategy that should have worked against any conventional military force. They opened their campaign by simultaneously attacking 17 different human installations across the sector. Each assault was perfectly coordinated with the others, creating a web of tactical that would require split-second timing to counter effectively. Any species trying to coordinate that many separate responses would either exhaust their command structure or leave critical positions vulnerable. The human response was immediate, and by standards, completely insane. Instead of trying to coordinate a defensive response across all 17 positions, the humans abandoned 12 of them entirely. Not a fighting withdrawal or strategic evacuation. They just packed up their most valuable equipment and left, sometimes while forces were still landing on the outer defensive perimeters. The remaining 5 installations transformed overnight into something that barely resembled their original purpose. Mining stations became fortress complexes, research facilities turned into weapon manufacturing centers, and civilian habitats sprouted defensive systems that shouldn't have been possible to construct without months of preparation. "They're consolidating their forces," observed Admiral. "Abandoning untenable positions to create strongpoints. It's actually quite rational." He was wrong. The humans weren't consolidating anything. They were setting a trap. The convinced that their strategy was working, moved to occupy the abandoned installations. Their hive mind allowed them to coordinate the capture and fortification of 12 strategic positions simultaneously, creating an interlocking network of defensive positions that should have made the sector impossible for the humans to retake. That's when we detected the first signs of human reinforcements entering the system. The ships that emerged from hyperspace, every classification system we had. They were enormous, easily 3 times the size of the largest vessels we had seen but they moved with the agility of fighters. Their hulls were covered in what appeared to be ablative armor that constantly shifted and changed, making it impossible to determine their actual configuration. "Colony ships," our intelligence analyst reported after running the sensor data through our databases. "But they've been extensively modified for. I'm not sure what they've been modified for." We found out when the first wave reached the occupied installations. The human colony ships didn't attack the positions. They bypassed them entirely and began establishing settlements on every uninhabited planet, moon, asteroid, and empty patch of space in the sector. Not military bases, actual civilian colonies, complete with families, schools, shopping centers, and entertainment districts. Within 48 standard hours, the humans had built more than 300 separate civilian settlements throughout the controlled territory. "What are they doing?" demanded our tactical officer. "Those civilians are sitting ducks that can destroy them at any time." That was exactly the point. The hive mind was built around logical strategic thinking. They could optimize military campaigns, coordinate complex operations, and predict enemy movements with mathematical precision. But they had never encountered an enemy that used their own civilians as tactical assets. Not human shields, tactical assets. Every human settlement was broadcasting on open channels, sending out signals that identified them as non-combatant civilian populations. According to every galactic warfare convention, they were off-limits to military attack. Being a civilized species despite their aggressive tendencies, couldn't simply massacre civilian populations without justifying their actions to the Galactic Council. But the settlements weren't just sitting there waiting to be protected. They were actively interfering with operations in ways that were technically non-military but practically devastating. Civilian mining operations began extracting resources from the same asteroids they needed for their defensive fortifications. Human families started building homes on planets that they had designated as strategic staging areas. Children's schools were established in orbital positions that blocked optimal firing lanes for weapons platforms. None of these actions violated any warfare conventions because they weren't military actions. They were just civilians going about their normal business in areas that happened to be tactically important to the campaign. The hive mind was not equipped to handle this kind of problem. They could calculate optimal responses to military threats, but they had no framework for dealing with enemy civilians who were simultaneously noncombatants and strategic obstacles. This is psychological warfare, our specialist reported. The humans are forcing them to choose between their tactical objectives and their civilized principles. It was worse than that. The humans were weaponizing civilization itself. The situation became even more complex when the human military forces began their actual counterstrike. But instead of attacking them directly, they started providing security services for their own civilian settlements. Human warships took up defensive positions around the colonies, but they were careful to maintain non-aggressive postures. They didn't target installations or threaten forces. They just sat there, protecting their civilians and monitoring movements with high-powered sensor arrays. The monitoring was the key. The human sensor networks, distributed across hundreds of civilian settlements, created a surveillance grid that covered the entire sector. Every movement was tracked, recorded, and analyzed by multiple human observation posts. But since the sensors were operated by civilian colonies for defensive purposes, they technically weren't military intelligence assets. They couldn't justify attacking them without admitting they were targeting noncombatants. The hive mind was trapped in a logical paradox. They couldn't achieve their military objectives without attacking civilian targets, but attacking civilian targets would violate their own ethical standards and bring down the wrath of the Galactic Council. That's when the humans revealed the true depth of their strategic thinking. Every civilian settlement had been positioned not just to interfere with operations, but to force them into predictable responses. The hive mind's logical nature meant that given a specific set of constraints, they would always choose the most mathematically optimal solution. The humans had created a three-dimensional chess game where they controlled the board, the pieces, and the rules, but made it look like they were winning. As they tried to work around the civilian settlements, their forces moved into positions that seemed strategically sound, but were actually elaborate kill zones. The humans had spent weeks studying tactical patterns, identifying their logical preferences, and creating scenarios where the optimal response would be exactly what the humans wanted. When the trap was finally sprung, it wasn't a battle. It was a masterpiece of strategic manipulation. The humans revealed that their civilian settlements had been construction projects all along. Not colonies, not homes, not businesses. Construction projects building the largest coordinated weapons system in galactic history. Every settlement had been building components of a sector-wide defensive grid that could project energy barriers, redirect hyperspace traffic, and create localized gravity wells. When activated simultaneously, the entire sector became a single massive weapon controlled from civilian settlements that they couldn't legally attack. But the true genius was that the system wasn't designed to destroy the forces, it was designed to capture them. The energy barriers trapped ships in specific areas. The gravity wells prevented them from achieving escape velocity. The hyperspace made it impossible to retreat from the sector. Within minutes, the entire invasion force was effectively imprisoned. The human fleet commander broadcast a message on all frequencies. Forces, you are surrounded by civilian populations who are concerned about the aggressive actions you've taken in their neighborhood. We're prepared to escort you to the edge of the sector where you can continue your journey safely. This offer expires in 1 standard hour. It was the most polite military surrender demand in galactic history. The hive mind spent 37 minutes calculating optimal responses before reaching the inevitable conclusion. They had been completely outmaneuvered by an enemy they didn't understand using tactics that shouldn't have been possible. They accepted the human offer. But the story didn't end with the withdrawal. That was just the beginning of the truly disturbing part. As the fleet prepared to leave the sector under human escort, several of their ships requested permission to remain behind. Not as prisoners or defeated enemies, as students. We wish to understand how you achieved this victory, transmitted the commander. Our hive mind is capable of learning, but we cannot comprehend how individual intelligences could coordinate such a complex strategy without direct neural links. The human response was typically insane. Sure, we love teaching people how to fight like us. Fair warning, though, it's going to feel really weird at first. They were offering to teach their enemies how to use human tactics. Within a solar cycle, joint human research stations appeared throughout the sector. The hive mind species that had tried to conquer human territory was now collaborating on projects that combined logical processing with human chaos theory. The results were terrifying. Drones began exhibiting individual initiative while maintaining their hive connection. Human commanders started displaying predictive capabilities that rivaled strategic computers. The hybrid tactics they developed together made pure human chaos look organized by comparison. "They're creating something new," reported our science officer. "A military doctrine that combines hive mind coordination with individual creativity. It shouldn't be possible." It shouldn't have been, but there it was. The humans had taken their deadliest enemies and turned them into partners, creating a combined force that was more dangerous than either species had been separately. Our observation mission ended when Admiral received direct orders from command to return home immediately. The political situation in our own territory was becoming unstable as various factions argued about whether to ally with the humans, fight them, or try to avoid them entirely. The debate was largely academic. The humans were expanding in all directions, not through conquest but through voluntary association. Species that fought them ended up joining them. Enemies became allies, rivals became partners, and the entire galactic balance of power shifted every time the humans encountered a new challenge. During our journey home, I spent countless hours reviewing the tactical recordings from both the and engagements. I was looking for patterns, trying to understand the underlying logic of human military thinking. What I found was more disturbing than random chaos. The humans did have rules. They had principles, strategies, and consistent tactical doctrines. But their rules were based on assumptions that no other species in the galaxy shared. They assumed that any problem could be solved with sufficient application of creativity and violence. They assumed that enemy capabilities were just potential assets waiting to be recruited. They assumed that impossible odds were simply parameters to be optimized around. Most disturbingly, they assumed that war was a collaborative effort between opposing forces to discover which combination of tactics and technologies was most effective. To humans, enemies weren't threats to be eliminated, they were teachers to be learned from. This explained their bizarre behavior during combat. The casual chatter, the apparent disregard for their own safety, the willingness to sacrifice their own forces, it was all part of a learning process. They were experimenting in real time, testing theories, and incorporating lessons learned from their opponents. Every battle was a classroom where the tuition was paid in blood, and the graduation ceremony involved either death or alliance. The humans had turned warfare into education, and they were very good students. This revelation came with disturbing implications. If the humans treated every enemy as a potential teacher, what happened when they encountered someone with nothing left to teach them? What did they do when they faced an opponent who couldn't offer them anything new to learn? We found out 6 months later when the Devourers arrived. The Devourers were not a species in any conventional sense. They were a force of nature, a plague that consumed entire star systems and moved on without leaving any trace of their passage. They had been dormant in the galactic rim for thousands of years, but something had awakened them. Intelligence reports suggested that human expansion into previously unexplored territories had disturbed whatever had been keeping the Devourers inactive. For the first time since making contact with galactic civilization, the humans were facing an enemy that was genuinely alien, not just another species with different tactics, but something that operated on principles that were completely incomprehensible. The Devourers didn't want territory, resources, or political power. They didn't communicate, negotiate, or show any interest in anything except consumption. They simply arrived at a star system, consumed everything in it, and moved on. There was nothing for the humans to learn from them, because there was nothing human about them at all. The galactic community held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen when the universe's most adaptable military force encountered something that couldn't be adapted to, learned from, or recruited. The answer would reshape everything we thought we knew about humans, warfare, and the nature of conflict itself. The Devourer incursion began at the edge of human space in a system they called Reach. It was a minor colony world with maybe 50,000 inhabitants, farmers, miners, and researchers studying the unusual stellar formations in that region. By the time the Galactic Council's early warning network detected the Devourer ships, Reach had already gone silent. Complete silence. No distress calls, no evacuation attempts, no final transmissions. One day the colony was sending routine status reports, and the next day there was nothing but empty space where a star system used to be. The Devourers hadn't just destroyed the colony. They had consumed the planets, the asteroids, the star itself. Where Reach had once orbited, there was now a perfect sphere of nothingness that hurt to look at directly. For the first time since humanity had entered galactic civilization, they were faced with something that couldn't be fought, reasoned with, or recruited. The Devourers were entropy given form, destruction without purpose, ending without beginning. The human response was immediate and completely predictable. They sent a fleet to investigate. Not a military fleet, a research expedition led by scientists, philosophers, and what the humans called theoretical warriors. These were soldiers who specialized in fighting enemies that didn't exist yet, tacticians who developed strategies for impossible scenarios, and strategists who planned campaigns against the laws of physics themselves. I was part of the joint observation force that followed them. By this point, half the galaxy was monitoring human military actions, trying to understand how they would handle a truly incomprehensible threat. The human research fleet arrived at the Reach void and immediately began doing the most human thing imaginable. They started poking it with instruments to see what would happen. They launched sensor probes into the nothingness, fired test shots at the boundary between existence and void, and even sent a volunteer crew in a specially shielded vessel to actually enter the consumed area and report on their findings. The volunteer crew never reported back, but their ship's telemetry revealed something that made our scientists question everything they thought they knew about reality. Inside the Devourer void, physics worked differently. Time flowed backward, energy moved from cold to hot, and matter spontaneously converted itself into forms that had no names in any language. "It's not destruction," reported the human chief scientist over open channels. "It's conversion. The Devourers aren't destroying matter and energy, they're changing it into something else entirely." "Something else like what?" demanded Admiral. "Something that doesn't exist in our universe. They're eating reality itself and excreting it into somewhere else." This revelation led to the most insane strategy session in galactic history. The humans gathered every expert they could find, not just their own scientists, but theorists, engineers, hive-mind calculators, and representatives from dozens of other species, and asked a simple question. How do we fight something that eats existence itself? The obvious answer was that you don't. You run. You evacuate everything in the path of the Devourers and hope they eventually run out of things to consume and move on to some other universe. The human answer was typically impossible. We figure out how to exist in a way they can't eat. They called it Project Impossible, which should have been our first warning about how seriously they were taking the situation. When humans named something impossible, they meant it as a challenge, not a limitation. The project combined every military innovation the humans had developed or learned from their various enemies. Precision engineering, hive mind coordination, human chaos theory, and technologies borrowed from dozens of other species were all integrated into something that had never been attempted before. They were going to build a fleet that could exist in multiple states of reality simultaneously. The theoretical foundation was insane. The humans had discovered that the Devourers could only consume matter and energy that existed in a single-dimensional state. By creating ships that existed partially in normal space and partially in alternate dimensions, they could theoretically create vessels that the Devourers couldn't fully devour. Theoretically, the practical engineering required to build such ships pushed every known technology to its breaking point and beyond. Hulls had to be constructed from materials that were simultaneously solid and intangible. Engines had to generate thrust in multiple dimensions at once. Crew members had to be temporarily modified to exist in quantum superposition without losing their sanity or their lives. The humans called them ghost ships, and they were the most terrifying things any of us had ever seen. The first prototype looked normal enough when powered down, just another human vessel with their characteristic improvised but functional aesthetic. But when the dimensional drives activated, it became something that my eyes couldn't properly focus on. It existed in several different states simultaneously, flickering between solid reality and something that was almost but not quite there. The crew reports from inside the ships were even more disturbing than the external appearance. Human soldiers and scientists described existing in probability clouds, where they could see and interact with multiple versions of themselves from slightly different timelines. They learned to coordinate actions not just with their current, but with alternate versions of their who might have made different decisions in parallel dimensions. "This is madness," observed our science officer. "They're turning their own people into quantum anomalies." The humans overheard our transmission and responded with typical casualness. "Yeah, it's pretty weird at first, but you get used to it. Plus, the tactical advantages are incredible. Try shooting at an enemy that exists in 17 different dimensional states simultaneously." They were treating the fundamental violation of reality as a minor inconvenience to be adapted to. The first field test came when the Devourers moved from the Reach Void toward the next inhabited system in their path, a research station called Deep Thought. The humans deployed their Ghost fleet to intercept, and we finally got to see warfare in action. The engagement was unlike anything in galactic history. When the Devourers encountered the human Ghost ships, they began their usual consumption process, but it only worked partially. They could devour the portions of the ships that existed in normal space, but the dimensional components remained intact, creating these bizarre hybrid vessels that were half consumed and half real. Instead of being destroyed, the Ghost ships became something that existed in the spaces between the Devourers' consumption fields. They could move freely through areas that had already been consumed because they weren't entirely there to begin with. But the truly insane part was what the humans did next. Instead of using their dimensional advantage to attack the Devourers from a safe distance, they began boarding the alien vessels. Not the ships, the Devourers themselves. It turned out that the entities the galaxy had been calling Devourers weren't ships at all. They were creatures, vast beings that existed primarily in dimensions adjacent to our own. What we had been seeing as vessels were actually feeding appendages that the creatures extended into normal space to consume matter and energy. The humans, existing partially in those same adjacent dimensions, could actually make physical contact with the Devourers' main bodies. What they found inside challenged every assumption about the threat they were facing. The Devourers weren't malevolent entities bent on destruction. They were refugees. "They're running from something," reported the human boarding team leader, his voice distorted by the dimensional interference. "Something that exists in their home dimensions and feeds on them the way they feed on us. They're trying to escape into our reality, but the only way they can exist here is by converting our matter into their dimensional state." The humans had discovered that the galaxy's most incomprehensible enemy was actually a victim of something even worse. This revelation led to the most bizarre negotiation in galactic history. The humans, speaking to the Devourers through dimensional translators while existing in quantum superposition, attempted to establish communication with entities that barely understood the concept of individual existence. The conversation, if it could be called that, lasted for 17 standard hours and required the combined linguistic skills of every sapient species in the galaxy. What emerged was a desperate plea from beings who were fleeing from something they called the final hunger, entities that consumed not just matter and energy, but the very concepts that allowed existence to have meaning. The Devourers were the survivors of entire universes that had been eaten by the final hunger. They were trying to establish colonies in our dimension, but their method of dimensional conversion was destroying everything they touched. The human solution was, of course, completely insane. "We'll teach them how to exist here without consuming everything," announced the human negotiation team. "And in exchange, they'll teach us how to fight the final hunger when it inevitably follows them here." They were proposing to solve an incomprehensible threat by turning it into an ally against an even more incomprehensible threat. The process of teaching entities how to coexist with three-dimensional matter required technologies that didn't exist and scientific principles that had never been tested. The humans approached it with their characteristic mixture of mad creativity and stubborn determination. Working with devourer refugees, they began developing hybrid technologies that could exist stable in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Cities that were simultaneously physical and conceptual, allowing devourers to inhabit spaces that wouldn't interfere with normal matter. Transportation networks that existed in the spaces between dimensions, letting the refugees move freely without affecting local space. The project took 2 years and required the cooperation of every major species in the galaxy. The humans coordinated it all with their usual chaotic efficiency, treating the impossible task as just another engineering problem to be solved through sufficient application of creativity and stubbornness. But the real test came when the final hunger arrived. I can't adequately describe what it was like when entities that eat concepts decided our universe looked appetizing. Space itself began forgetting how to exist. Stars went out not because they ran out of fuel, but because the idea of fusion ceased to have meaning in areas affected by the final hunger. The joint human-devourer defense fleet that met them was something beyond imagination. Ships that existed in normal space fought alongside entities that existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. Human crews coordinated with devourer refugees who communicated through modulations in the fabric of reality itself. The battle, if something that transcended the normal definitions of combat could be called a battle, lasted for 6 months and was fought on battlefields that included not just three-dimensional space, but concepts like causality, entropy, and the relationship between existence and meaning. The humans treated it as the ultimate learning experience. "This is incredible," transmitted one human commander during a particularly intense phase of the conflict. "We're literally fighting against the cessation of logic itself. When are we going to get another chance to test our tactics against something that doesn't believe in existence?" They were enjoying themselves while fighting entities that could erase the concept of matter from the universe. The final hunger was eventually defeated, not destroyed, because destruction was a concept they could consume, but convinced to move on to easier targets. The human strategy had been to make our universe too complicated and chaotic for them to digest efficiently. They succeeded by making reality itself more human. Working with their devourer allies, the humans had introduced elements of chaos theory into the fundamental structure of local space. They made existence itself unpredictable, random, and resistant to systematic consumption. The final hunger, which operated on principles of perfect order and inevitable consumption, found our region of space too disorganized to process efficiently. In essence, the humans had weaponized their own chaotic nature and used it to make our entire sector of the galaxy indigestible to cosmic forces of entropy. The aftermath of the final hunger war reshaped galactic civilization completely. The humans were no longer seen as a chaotic military force to be studied and contained. They were recognized as the galaxy's primary defense against threats that transcended normal reality. Every major species began incorporating human tactical principles into their own military doctrines, not because human methods were superior to traditional approaches, but because human methods were the only ones that worked against enemies that didn't follow conventional rules. The Empire, my own people, formally requested human military advisors to help reorganize our entire strategic doctrine. We had finally accepted that our ordered, logical approach to warfare was a liability in a universe where the greatest threats were entities that treated logic itself as food. The devourer refugees became permanent residents of our galaxy, establishing dimensional colonies that existed alongside normal space without interfering with it. They shared their knowledge of technologies in exchange for protection from future incursions by the final hunger. But perhaps the most significant change was in how we understood conflict itself. The humans had shown us that war wasn't just about defeating enemies. It was about learning from them, adapting to them, and ultimately finding ways to coexist with forces that seemed incompatible with existence itself. They had turned the universe's most dangerous threats into teachers and allies. As I compile these reports for the final archive, I realized that my initial assessment of human military capabilities was completely wrong. The humans weren't chaotic because they lacked discipline or organization. They were chaotic because they understood something the rest of us had forgotten. In a universe full of impossible threats, Impossible solutions were the only ones that worked. Their apparent randomness was actually a highly sophisticated form of anti-strategy, designed to counter enemies who relied on predictable patterns. Their casual attitude toward death and destruction wasn't callousness. It was acceptance that some problems could only be solved by people willing to sacrifice everything for solutions that might not work. Most importantly, their tendency to turn enemies into allies wasn't naive idealism. It was practical recognition that the universe was too dangerous for any species to face alone. The humans had taught us that true military strength didn't come from superior weapons or better tactics. It came from the ability to adapt to anything, learn from anyone, and find creative solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve. They had shown us that chaos, properly applied, was the most powerful force in the universe. And they had done it all while treating the entire experience as an educational opportunity. The galaxy is safer now because the humans exist in it, not because they've eliminated all threats, but because they've taught us how to think like them when facing threats we can't understand. They've shown us that the best defense against cosmic horror is cosmic creativity. When the next impossible threat emerges from the deep spaces between galaxies, we'll meet it with human-trained forces equipped with technologies that shouldn't exist, using tactics that violate every established principle of warfare. We'll meet it with organized chaos, weaponized creativity, and the absolute certainty that somewhere in our combined knowledge and experience, there's a solution that's just crazy enough to work. Because the humans have taught us their most important lesson. In a universe where anything is possible, the most impossible solution is usually the right one. The human battlefield was absolute chaos, but chaos, we learned, was exactly what the universe needed.